Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something, well, something we've all dealt with,
Yeah.
fever.
hmm
But we're going beyond just how to make it go away. We
Yeah.
want to dig into why it happens at all.
Exactly.
We've got some really interesting material here, including a paper that's coming out soon. It's called A Clinical and Evolutionary Perspective of the Immunological Role of Fever and the Iatrogenic Induction of Cytokine Storm.
Right. And it's backed by, 77 scientific articles? Quite substantial.
Yeah, solid stuff.
So think of this as the inside track for you, the learner,
Yeah.
on understanding fever. We're trying to move past just, take 2 pills and call me in the morning. We
Yeah.
want to get into the why. And the big idea here, the core concept, is that fever, or the technical term endogenous hyperthermia, isn't just an annoying symptom.
Okay.
It's actually a core piece of our immune system, a defense that's been shaped over, 600 million years of evolution. It's fundamental.
600 million years. Wow. Okay, that really grabs your attention. Let's jump right into that. That's just a staggering amount of time.
It is.
So this paper, it really hammers home how important understanding fever is, doesn't it? Not just for doctors, but for all of biology.
Absolutely. It draws on, I think, 3 decades of the author's own experience, plus all that research you mentioned. And the main thrust is, fever is vital for immunity. Essential.
And the flip side of that coin is maybe messing with it isn't such a great idea.
That seems to be the strong implication, yes. Inhibiting it could cause, significant problems.
Okay, so let's stick with that evolutionary angle for a bit. You mentioned hyperthermia.
Right. So that's the fever we experience as warm-blooded animals. But also think about cold-blooded creatures. They exhibit what's called behavioral fever.
Behavioral fever. What's that? Like they choose to get rummer.
Exactly. Picture a lizard that's sick. It'll deliberately go find a sunny spot, spend more time basking. It's actively raising its body temperature.
Huh. I never thought of it that way.
And the paper argues that this drive for higher temperature, whether it's internal or behavioral, has been strongly selected for by evolution. Basically, the benefits for fighting off germs have consistently outweighed the risks over millions and millions of years.
So it helps them survive infections better.
Definitely. The paper calls fever a pangenocidal adaptation, meaning it works against a whole bunch of different pathogens.
Germicidal.
And it's not just theoretical. There's a lot of science, clinical observations, too, that back this up. What's really wild is that even invertebrates do this.
Seriously. Like insects or worms.
Yeah. And here's the kicker. If you take infected cold-blooded animals, ectotherms, and you stop them from getting to heat sources,
Uh-oh.
their death rates shoot up dramatically. We're talking 75 to 100% mortality in some studies. It's devastating.
Wow. That's incredibly clear evidence, isn't it?
It really is. And studies on things like zebrafish, other species too, they all point the same way. Fever is crucial for survival when they get infected.
So this behavioral thing, seeking heat, it's not just about feeling warmer.
No, it actually works with their immune system. It's synergistic. The heat acts almost like a signal amplifier for their innate immunity, tells the defenses to ramp up.
Right. Kicks things into gear.
Yeah. And the fact that this response is so conserved, across incredibly diverse species over all this time.
Despite the downsides.
Exactly. Despite the energy cost for us warm-blooded types and the fact that a lizard basking is more vulnerable to predators.
It must be doing something incredibly important. Nature doesn't usually keep things around for 600 million years if they aren't pulling their weight.
Precisely. Which brings us back to what happens when we interfere.
Yeah, what are the dangers, according to this paper, of just routinely trying to knock down a fever with, say, paracetamol or ibuprofen?
Well, the argument is pretty stark. Using antipyretics, those fever-reducing drugs, essentially depresses your immune system right when it needs to be at its peak performance.
Suppresses it?
Yeah.
How?
By preventing that beneficial temperature rise and potentially disrupting the coordinated immune signaling we'll talk about later, the author frames it as a potentially serious and avoidable therapeutic error.
An error in treatment. That's strong language, especially for something so common.
It is strong. And they specifically mention viral respiratory infections like COVID-19 as a context where this might be particularly problematic.
Okay, so it's not just about feeling better. There could be actual negative consequences for the immune fight.
Yes. The paper presents evidence suggesting that trying to mitigate this natural fever response, this endogenous hyperthermia, can actually make the underlying pathology worse, especially in critical settings like ICUs.
Worse, how so?
They even cite a large study over 8,400 ICU patients, which indicated that suppressing fever might actually increase mortality at the population level.
Increased mortality. That's
Right.
really concerning, if true.
It's a finding that definitely warrants attention, absolutely. It makes you pause and question the routine practice.
And what about the cytokine storm? That term became quite well known recently. How does the paper connect that to fever suppression?
Ah, yes. The paper puts forward a really interesting idea here. It suggests the cytokine storm isn't necessarily an inevitable part of the disease itself.
Oh.
Instead, it's described as an iatrogenic supercompensation reaction.
Iatrogenic, meaning caused by medical treatment.
Exactly. Primarily caused, the paper argues, by antipyretics, and potentially made worse by poor nutritional status, like low vitamin D or C.
So the drugs we take to lower the fever might actually be contributing to that massive inflammatory overreaction.
That's the hypothesis presented. It's a form of supercompensation. The body's trying to achieve that fever state, the drugs are blocking it, and the signaling molecules, the cytokines, just keep getting pumped out in an attempt to overcome the block.
Like pushing harder on a door that's jammed.
Kind of, yeah. And there's another population-level aspect, too.
Go on.
The author suggests that widespread fever suppression could actually elevate the R0 of infections.
The R0, the reproductive number. How?
Well, think about it. If you take medication, your fever goes down, you might feel, artificially better, well enough to go out, go to work, interact with people.
Almost still infectious.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you could end up spreading it to more people than if you'd stayed home feeling miserable with a proper fever, which paradoxically could lead to higher overall mortality in the population, even if individuals feel better temporarily.
That's a really sobering perspective on public health. Okay, this is fascinating. Let's get into the mechanics then. How does fear actually work?
Yeah.
And how do the drugs mess with that?
Okay, let's break it down. So you get an infection. Pathogens, like viruses or bacteria, often release toxins or have components that our body recognizes as foreign. These act as alarm bells, pyrogenic signals.
Pyrogenic, meaning heat-generating signals.
Essentially, yes.
Ah.
These signals are picked up by immune cells, particularly macrophages. Think of them as sentinels. When they detect these signals, they release our own internal pyrogens.
Our own signal.
Yeah, endogenous pyrogens. These are mainly cytokines, signaling molecules like interleukin-1, IL-1, interleukin-6, IL-6, and interferons. These are the body's first responders, chemically speaking.
Okay, so macrophages sound the alarm internally.
Right. These pyrogens then circulate in the blood and travel to the brain, specifically to the hypothalamus.
The body's thermostat.
Precisely. In the hypothalamus, these pyrogens trigger the production of another molecule, prostaglandin E2, and it's this prostaglandin E2 that directly tells the hypothalamus to raise the body's temperature set point.
Like dialing the thermostat up.
Exactly like that. But it's not just about temperature, it's beautifully coordinated.
How so?
Well, take IL-1, one of those key initial pyrogens. While it's telling the hypothalamus to raise the temperature, it's also signaling other immune cells, lymphocytes, telling them to secrete interferon and another cytokine called IL-2.
And what do?
They're crucial for orchestrating the wider immune attack, activating T cells, B cells, the whole adaptive immune response.
Ah, okay. So it's all happening together.
Yes. The paper really stresses this point. The same molecules that induce the fever are simultaneously activating the immune fighters. This synchronicity strongly suggests fever isn't passive, it's an active part of the strategy. An immunoagonistic role, they call it.
Immunoagonistic.
Okay.
So it helps the immune system. It's not just collateral damage.
That's the argument. Fever actively supports and enhances the immune response.
Which means when we take an antipyretic.
We interfere with this whole coordinated process right at the control center, the hypothalamus. We might block the temperature rise, but we're also potentially disrupting that synchronized immune activation signal.
But hang on, why does blocking the fever lead to more cytokines, the storm? That seems counterintuitive.
It does at first glance, but it makes sense when you think about feedback loops. Biological systems rely heavily on negative feedback.
Like a thermostat turning the furnace off when the room is warm enough.
Exactly. So the immune cells releasing the initial pyrogens, like macrophages, might also have ways to sense if the temperature is actually rising or if the downstream effects are happening. Okay. If an antipyretic blocks prostaglandin E2 synthesis in the hypothalamus, The temperature doesn't rise. The signal essentially gets stopped there.
Right.
So the upstream cells, the macrophages, don't get the feedback that the fever job is being done. Their response might be, hey, we're sending the signal, but nothing's happening. We need to send more signal.
Ah, so they overcompensate. They just keep shouting louder, releasing more and more cytokines.
That's the proposed mechanism for the supercompensation. They're trying desperately to reach that optimal germicidal temperature, but the drug is preventing the thermostat from responding, leading to this flood of cytokines.
And you said this mainly happens in people taking the drugs?
Yes. The paper notes this cytokine supercompensation is almost invariably seen following drug-induced fever suppression in medicated patients. But it's apparently rare in people who are well-nourished and just let the fever run its course naturally.
Interesting. Is there direct evidence for this compensatory release?
Well, they mentioned studies showing that antipyretic treatment can actually lead to higher levels of interferon early in infections.
Higher interferon, even though the drug is supposed to reduce inflammation.
Right. Which supports the idea that the body is trying to compensate for the blocked fever signal by pumping out more of these initial pyrogenic messengers.
Okay, that model makes a certain kind of biological sense.
The paper draws analogies to other systems too, like how thyroid hormone is regulated. If you block thyroid hormone receptors, the pituitary gland pumps out more TSH to try and stimulate the thyroid.
Or blood sugar?
Or blood sugar, yeah. If insulin receptors aren't working well, the pancreas might initially pump out more insulin. It's a common biological principle. Block the signal or its reception, and the source often ramps up production.
So antipyretics don't stop the macrophages making cytokines?
No, they primarily block the reception of the fever signal in the brain, which paradoxically leads to the macrophages making more cytokines.
Okay. That explanation helps clarify the potential mechanism behind the cytokine storm link. But, practically speaking, people are scared of fevers, especially high ones. I know I am, instinctively.
Yeah.
Where does that deep-seated fear come from?
Yeah, the paper addresses that directly. It suggests that a lot of the drive to aggressively treat fever, the patient demanding something for relief or doctors routinely prescribing it, it seems rooted in the fear of neurological complications, specifically febrile seizures.
Right, febrile seizures. That's the big one you hear about, especially with kids.
Absolutely. It's a legitimate concern for parents. But crucially, we need to look at the actual risk.
Okay, what does the paper say about the risk?
For adults who don't have epilepsy, the risk of a febrile seizure is extremely rare, like maybe 1 in 100,000 cases, vanishingly small.
1 in 100,000. Wow. Okay, what about kids?
In kids, the risk is higher, but still relatively low overall. Around 0.6%, typically occurring in children aged 6 months to 5 years, usually when the temperature gets above 38.3 Celsius or about 101 Fahrenheit. And most febrile seizures, while scary, are benign and don't cause long-term harm.
So even in the group most associated with them, it's less than 1%.
Correct. And the point the author makes is, does this relatively low risk, especially the minuscule risk in adults, really justify the routine, almost automatic suppression of fever in everyone, given its vital immune role?
That's a fair question.
Especially considering the potential harms of suppression we just discussed, particularly for vulnerable patients like those in the ICU. It raises the question, as the author puts it, why critical thinking about fever seems to have been, well, globally suppressed.
Suppressed, what do they mean?
Perhaps overlooked or sidelined might be better words. Suggesting that maybe fear or habit or maybe even pharmaceutical marketing has played a role in preventing a more rational risk-benefit approach to fever management. Why the default is always bring it down.
It does make you wonder why the nuance seems lost in translation, from the science to common practice sometimes.
Indeed.
All right, so the paper argues strongly against routine pharmacological suppression using drugs, but fevers are uncomfortable. Does it offer any advice on managing that discomfort?
Yes, it makes an important distinction. While drugs that block the prostaglandin E2 pathway in the brain carry these potential risks, using physical methods for comfort, like putting a cool cloth on the forehead, doesn't seem to interfere with that central immune activation process in the same way. So that can provide symptomatic relief without disrupting the core mechanism.
So cooling the skin is okay. It's messing with the brain's thermostat that's the issue.
That appears to be the distinction drawn, yes. Though they do add a caveat. In specific situations like head trauma, managing fever pharmacologically might be necessary, but that should be under expert medical supervision, obviously.
Right. Specific clinical scenarios differ.
Absolutely. And another key practical point the paper raises is nutrition.
Ah, yes, you mentioned vitamin D and C earlier in relation to cytokine storms.
Exactly. Maintaining good levels of what they call immunoessential nutrients, things like selenium, magnesium, vitamin D, vitamin C, is really important for a robust and well-regulated immune response.
How did that connect to fever?
Well, deficiencies in these nutrients might make the body more prone to excessive inflammation, potentially contributing to that cytokine supercompensation if fever is suppressed. So, good nutrition supports the body's ability to manage the whole process effectively.
So it's about supporting the body's natural systems rather than just overriding them.
That's a good way to put it. And the overarching theme is the need for more personalized medicine here, moving away from blanket protocols for fever towards decisions based on the individual patient and their specific situation.
Okay, this has been incredibly insightful.
Hmm.
If we were to try and summarize the absolute key takeaway from this deep dive on fever, what would it be?
I'd say the core message is fever isn't the enemy. It's a deeply ancient, highly sophisticated defense mechanism. It's fundamentally important for immunity, both innate and adaptive,
Yeah.
and routinely suppressing it with drugs, particularly in adults and the critically ill, might be doing more harm than good in many cases. It could be counterproductive, potentially worsening outcomes.
So what's the call to action for our listeners, for the learner?
Be informed. Use this knowledge. Have conversations with your healthcare providers about the role of fever. Don't just accept the automatic, take this to bring it down. Ask questions.
And the resources.
Remember those 77 references in the paper. And the paper itself will be up on the author's website, ernestapretigradackos.com, under the science section. Arm yourself with the data.
Excellent. It definitely shifts the perspective, doesn't it? Thinking about something we usually just want to get rid of as potentially beneficial.
It really does, and it leaves you with a pretty profound question to ponder, I think. We're talking about a biological program refined over 600 million years of trial and error by nature. Are we sure our relatively recent habit of chemically suppressing it is always the smartest move? Is our, let's say, cultural intelligence always superior to the intelligence of nature?
That is definitely something to mull over. A great provocative thought to end on. And you mentioned there might be more for those who want to go even deeper.
Yes, definitely. For healthcare professionals or anyone really interested in the nitty-gritty technical details, there's going to be a follow-up discussion, more in depth.
Where can people find that?
It'll be on YouTube on the Ernesto Prieto Gratakos channel, probably next week, maybe Wednesday. Subscribing there is the best way to get notified. We'll get more into the specific mechanisms of viral defense and all that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for taking us through this complex topic today.
My pleasure.
And thank you, the learner, for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep questioning. It's how we learn.